Not allies, but better than allies. This is how the Chinese describe their relationship with Russia. A statement meant to show mutual support and cooperation speaks far more about the divides between the two nations. The truth is, Russia and China have as much in common as they have in opposition, and it could spark a war. There are multiple points of contention in the China-Russia relationship. Both are autocratic dictatorships. Only China has at least given up the pretense of democracy. Both nations are seen as unfriendly to the current Western-led world order. Both nations suffer internationally for that. It would seem as if the two nations should be best friends, especially when their chief rivals are the United States of America and its extensive network of friends and allies. Yet differences that threaten war run deep, and if the two went at it, it might not end the way you think. Historically speaking, China has been the junior partner. After the triumph of communism in China post-World War II, the Soviet Union was quick to become a sponsor of the nation. However, ideological rifts soon led to outright border clashes, and just 2 decades later, the BFFs were on the splits, with China cozying up to the United States of all places. The US-China relationship would soon turn adversarial, however, and China re-gravitated back toward the Soviet Union. By the time this happened, though, the Soviets were on the verge of collapse, and the balance of power between the two nations changed dramatically after the end of the Soviet Union. While the Soviets had been the far superior power during the Cold War, China's rapid modernization during the 90s, Russia's loss of much of their former Soviet territory, and industrial and intellectual capacity led to a more even balance of power between the two countries. But Russia was always on the declining side of the scale, as its economic development focused on reactivating former Soviet capabilities while China was building brand new ones. Russia was annoyed at the fact that the former client state was now very much an equal partner, and as the balance of power continued to become more askew, with China's economy growing to over 3.5 times the size of Russia's. A new ideological divide has sprung between the two nations, with the Russians resenting that it's now the junior partner, and China reveling in their current superiority over the Russian nation. But there are very real material reasons for a decisive souring of relations between the two states. Russia has long resented the fact that the Russian Far East region is increasingly becoming, in the words of the Russian politicians, Chinese. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been a major depopulation of the Russian Far East, made even worse by the fact that the new Russian state has failed to significantly increase infrastructure investments in the region. Illegal Chinese and Korean immigrants, meanwhile, have flocked to the region, along with a great number of very legal Chinese immigrants, alongside a lot of Chinese investment. The situation for Russia looks increasingly dire as Chinese firms pour money into the area, with the nation admitting that it has no other recourse but to accept the Chinese money. There's now a very real fear in the minds of Russian politicians that the Russian Far East will soon be lost to Southern Asian powers like China. Not necessarily militarily, but economically, as foreign control over the region's developed energy supplies is growing year by year via investments. Culturally, the region is also starting to swing toward China as more and more immigration and investment comes from that nation. With such a weak government, military, and economic presence in the region, it's not outside the scope of imagination that in a few decades, the Russian Far East may push for independence and absorption by China. China clearly has a reason to manipulate events and ensure this happens, as the Russian Far East remains very resource-rich. For energy-hungry China, whose economy has only recently begun to slow down, securing energy supplies is of critical economic importance. But it's a necessity for an altogether different reason as well. China currently has a massive Achilles heel that ensures it will not be able to militarily challenge the United States. And that's the fact that it imports most of its oil via sea trade routes that the U.S. Navy can easily disrupt. Secure landlocked energy resources that the U.S. cannot interrupt frees up the Chinese Communist Party to more directly challenge the U.S., even militarily if need be. To this end, China has been fiercely competing with Russia for control over the energy resources of Central Asia, exerting massive influence and swinging smaller nations away from Russia. However, there is one final point of contention that is deeply souring the Sino-Russian relationship. For decades, China was a dependable and loyal client for the sale of Soviet and then Russian weapons. With no modern defense industry to speak of, China bought most of its equipment from Russia. However, as China has modernized, so too did its defense industry, decreasing its reliance on foreign suppliers. But Chinese modernization has come at the expense of Russian trade secrets, with Chinese agents being caught red-handed multiple times, stealing or attempting to steal classified Russian technology. China has also violated the tenets of some of its licensing agreements with Russia, especially regarding its fighter aircraft, multiple Soviet and then Russian fighter designs were approved for license manufacture in China, on the condition that China still purchase Russian engines and electronics for those aircraft, the two areas that China remains weak in. However, Chinese engineers began to reverse engineer Russian components and build their own copies of Russian engines and avionics. This greatly angered Russia. However, the nation was so cash-strapped that it had no other option but to continue allowing licensing of its fighter designs. China's maturing defense sector, however, means it has little need to continue licensing Russian designs. This is most evident by the development of the J-20, which is inferior to U.S. fifth-generation aircraft, but superior to Russia's own Su-57. To add insult to injury, Russia believes that China stole much of the technology that went into the J-20, driving an even deeper divide between the two nations. With egos, control over energy infrastructure and supplies, and increasing Russian desperation for recognition on the world stage, who would win if the two nations went to war? Since the end of the Cold War, Russia's military power has kept it firmly in the number 2 spot globally. However, estimates of Russian basic competency, availability of equipment, and effectiveness of their weapon system have proven to be severely overblown. Russia, it turns out, is utterly incapable of facing off against a modern military force and is best suited for minor conflicts against much weaker powers like Syrian rebels. Up against even a very small amount of NATO hardware, Russia has failed horribly in Ukraine, and the times it did go directly up against NATO weapons, its losses were catastrophic. Safe to say, Russia is no longer the world's second-best military. This leaves China as the world's second military power after the US, but the revelations about the Russian military has put China's own military power into serious doubt. China has historically struggled to clearly define its military doctrine. Despite being the far superior power, China was still militarily defeated by the much smaller and war-exhausted Vietnam in 1979. China claimed victory, yet failed to achieve its strategic objectives of preventing Vietnam from overthrowing Pol Pot from Cambodia, leaving no question to who really won the conflict. A lot of Chinese military doctrine was based on Soviet doctrine, and this only began to change in 1991 as the United States absolutely trashed much more numerous Iraqi forces, themselves deeply entrenched in Soviet doctrine. Beijing went into a state of panic. In the first direct confrontation between US and Soviet doctrine, the US was not just proven the winner, but Soviet military doctrine was proven to be vastly inferior. US doctrines of air-land battle and deep strikes using smaller number of more technologically sophisticated forces to sever lines of communication and disrupt enemy operations was so effective that in Moscow it was said that the only way to stop a US offensive was with nuclear weapons. Russia failed to learn this historical lesson, but China was an eager student. However, modernizing warfighting doctrine is not something easy for a nation deeply entrenched in the old Soviet order and dealing with massive amounts of corruption. Today, China has attempted to emulate the US combined arms operations within its own military, but while it's likely the superior emulator of US tactics, there's serious questions of just how good it really is. For starters, China's corruption problem might be as deep and systemic as Russia's has proven to be, severely eroding China's warfighting capabilities. It wasn't until Xi Jinping's anti-corruption purges in the late 2010s that China took any meaningful steps toward correcting a rampant and out-of-control culture of corruption across its armed services. But as many observers have pointed out, these anti-corruption purges might have been just as much political tools to eliminate rivals as they were tools to make actual progress on changing Chinese military culture, leaving the efficacy of the purges and real Chinese competency in serious doubt. The problem may still be as systemic as Russia's. For generations, the Chinese military operated on a tradition of gifting, where junior officers gave gifts to their superiors in exchange for promotions. This places little value on actual experience and capability, putting incompetent officers in command. Another serious question to Chinese capabilities is the fact that China is yet to prove that it can actually carry out modern combat operations of high intensity. For years, China refused to send its troops on UN peacekeeping missions for fear of being embarrassed by their performance. Even more telling, however, is the fact that China only recently modernized its military with a joint operations command structure similar to America's, allowing for its various military services to more easily operate together in combat and allow for real combined arms warfare. As encouraging as this news may be, though, China has also a very long precedent of insufficient or very low-quality training for its troops, with many of them being used for physical labor by their commanders in local infrastructure projects and training exercises being neither frequent nor realistic. To top it all off, it's important to remember that China has also never fought a modern conflict. So what would happen if the two powers went to war? If a war broke out between the two today, China would undoubtedly have the upper hand. Mongolia would become an unwitting avenue of attack for the Chinese forces, pushing into the very soft underbelly of the Russian Central and Far East districts. Historically, Russia has kept significant forces in the region to deter such an attack, but as the war in Ukraine drags on, men and equipment are being increasingly relocated to Ukraine. China, meanwhile, has no such commitments nor borders with potentially hostile nations, save for India. But the Chinese-Indian border is too mountainous for any serious land invasion to occur there. Chinese forces would be able to concentrate in the region, and with Mongolia largely doing whatever China tells it to, they'd have clear travel routes to the Russian border. The Russian Air Force would be integral in defending from a Chinese attack in the region, and here Russia does have a significant advantage. While the Chinese fighter fleet is more numerous at 1,200 aircraft versus Russia's 772, China still has a significant number of very old aircraft in its inventory, which would not fare well against Russia's one clear and decisive advantage: ground-based air defenses. Having prepared for decades to fight against the superior U.S. Air Force, Russia decided to not compete with the U.S. in the sky, but rather deny the sky to it by investing in air defense systems. Russia's S-300 and S-400, and now the S-500, are some of the best air defense systems in the world, even if they have trouble shooting slower HIMARS rockets down. With the air defense batteries already in the Central and Far East regions, Chinese air power would be seriously threatened if it tried to operate near the front lines, allowing Russia's Air Force to operate much more freely and directly threaten Chinese ground forces in a way China couldn't reciprocate. To add to China's difficulties, it would have to rapidly build up expeditionary airfields in Mongolia closer to the front lines due to its limited number of tanker aircraft and fighter aircraft capable of mid-air refueling. In terms of technology, the two militaries are likely at a healthy level of parity, but Russia is at a disadvantage due to the ongoing war in Ukraine and the effect of international sanctions. Predicting a victor and how such a war would play out becomes nearly impossible, given that the extent of Russian corruption and incompetence on the battlefield so far makes it questionable if it would ever be able to confront a near peer to the US, such as China. But while Russian deficiencies are in full display in Ukraine, China's own deficiencies are as well hidden today as Russia's were on February 23rd of 2022. One day before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was believed to be a formidable and capable military power who would steamroll a much smaller nation armed almost exclusively with legacy Soviet-era equipment. China, likewise, is today believed to be a modern and capable power, who's considered to be a near-peer adversary to the US. There are many indicators that China's own incompetency is as well hidden as Russia's was. The United States, meanwhile, has proven in various modern conflicts that its forces are extremely capable, even against significant threats. China has had no such opportunity. In all likelihood, a war between China and Russia today would devolve into a dragged-down fight as both nations struggle to use modern doctrine alongside their high-tech weapons. The only conclusion we're comfortable making, however, is that in the case of war, the Chinese would likely neutralize Kamchatka and rout the Russian Navy. While China is still incapable of providing support for major naval operations far from home, Kamchatka is near enough to China and Russian defenses are light enough that the Chinese PLAN would likely emerge victorious. Once Kamchatka is secured, Chinese forces could begin a serious push for the Russian Far East, and while it's unlikely they would be able to threaten much of central Russia, the Far East region would likely fall to Chinese control and be annexed. With a great amount of energy resources there, even at a staggeringly high military cost, China would come out the winner. Here, we get to the crux of the problem, as Russia would inevitably use nuclear weapons once its territorial integrity was threatened. Without its own nuclear retaliation, Chinese forces would be annihilated, meaning that in order for there to be any victor in a serious Sino-Russian war, nuclear weapons would have to be used. Now go watch China's World War III plan, or click this other video instead.